great turnout on this beautiful evening. You could be doing lots of other things other than listening to me walking away here. I'd like to take the fame. Look, I've worked in BirdWatch for 25 years and still doing a bit with them. Only live about 2 kilometres that way, so fairly local. Not all that familiar with the whole project. I'm going to plunge in the deep end here, but I'm going to talk about birds of woodland and whatever little ditties I can tell you about them on the way. And we're particularly looking at broadleaf woodland because it's a lot more interesting than conifers. I think we'll all agree on that. And this is lovely oak wood up in Clara Vale. Fairly straight trees there, but anyway. So I'm going to just go through some of the common birds. I'm sure you all, a lot of familiar faces here, you're well familiar with them. Anybody know what that is? It's a wren. You nearly got there. The next one's a dunnock because it's a very large wren. It's quite a small bird, of course, but it's actually one of the commonest birds in Ireland, and it's it is the most widespread bird. That is to say, if you survey every 1 kilometre square in Ireland, you'll find that it's in something like 95% of squares. I remember the first bird I heard landing on the Skelligs one time was a wren. Before the kittiwakes even, there was a wren singing up on Skellig Michael. So they can survive in a whole range of habitats, but they're very much a woodland bird as well as a farmland bird. Somebody mentioned dunnock a minute ago. That's a dunnock. A bird you'll find in your garden and hedgerows, but also in woodland. If you have a good understory or a good shrub layer, you'll certainly get dunnocks in woodland, but they're mostly at the woodland edge. No prizes for guessing what that one is. But again, they're a bird you'll get in gardens and hedgerows. Hedgerows, of course, are in a way a kind of a substitute for all the forests we've lost. So you're going to get a crossover between woodland and farmland species, if you like, hedgerows. In Ireland, we actually have very few woodland specialists, and we come to that a bit later on. But I'll just show you this is a kind of a woodland edge effect. It's a very interesting habitat where you will get some of those birds that you won't find in the densest part of the forest. And certainly, if this whole project goes ahead and lots of oak trees get planted up there, you have those early stages. Okay, these are beech here and some of these, but beech and birch. But it's the early stages in the first sort of 10, 20 years when the trees are quite small. You get other interesting species like stonechats and whitethroats in that habitat who aren't actually woodland species, but as the succession goes on or as the trees mature, you're going to get other species coming in. So you're all familiar with blackbird, of course, very common. Again, they're woodland species as much as they are in hedgerows. Which of the thrushes is that? Song thrush, yeah. Song thrush has these arrow shapes. Ever confused by them? It has quite buffy kind of colours and kind of arrow shapes on the breast, whereas the other one, the missel thrush, is a much bigger animal altogether and much greyer looking, and the spots tend to be more rounded. Missel thrush is the one you see out on golf courses, and they're cocking the head and getting at worms and so on, but they're very much a forest species when it comes to nesting. They nest very high in the bough of a tree. A blackbird and a song thrush can be well hidden down in low cover, whereas a missel thrush, they're very aggressive, or at least they're able to defend themselves from magpies and jays, so they don't mind making a nest that's really exposed in a bough, very high up in an oak tree and nicely camouflaged by moss and so on. So that's the missel thrush, and not as common as the song thrush. I'm sure you all know that your tit family, you've got the blue tit, is very much a forest woodland species. And of course, all the tits, well, the 3 of them anyway, nest in cavities. And quite a few birds I'll talk about nest in holes in trees. So we need old, mature wood and old, standing dead wood for the birds to nest in. And that's the great tit. It's a lot bigger, hence the name, great tit, and it's big. That's a male there. The female has a slightly thinner line going down the front. First, the birds you'll hear in the springtime going, sounds like saying teacher. Teacher, teacher, teacher. It's a very persistent sound. You hear it off in the distance. The great tit's an interesting bird that's been studied a lot in woodlands because blue tits and great tits particularly, they depend on an abundance of caterpillars just to coincide with when they're feeding the young. And this whole thing of phenology, of monitoring, when your first celandines come out, when the first swallow comes and all these sort of things. With the dreaded climate change, you're finding that they're getting slightly out of sync. So if the insect life or the caterpillars are appearing too early or too late, for the great tit to be feeding the young. That can cause a problem and affect their productivity. So it's a bird that's been studied a lot in that whole context. The one that you won't see so much in broadleaf woodland is the coal tit. It's very similar in a way to the great tit. If you compare it, the great tit, which yellower looking and has a continuous line around the facial area, and maybe you can just see on the nape, on the back of the head, it's got a white patch. It's quite a small, nice little bird. You get them to come into your feeders, I'm quite sure you'll see them. But they're more a bird of coniferous woodland. But if you had even a couple of, say, Scots pines in amongst your broadleaf trees, you can certainly get coaches. It's nearly always in conifers. To make the full set, we've had blue tit, great tit, coal tit, the lovely little bird, the long-tailed tit. When you probably get them coming into your gardens, into your feeders, they always remind you of a bunch of monkeys, naughty little monkeys with the long tails that come in and they just have a little feed and then and scurry on past as if they're in an awful hurry somewhere else. But they make a gorgeous little nest. They don't nest in a cavity in a tree. The other three do. They make a dome-shaped nest. Beautiful nest out of moss and covered in lichens, and then it's covered with spiders' webs. And this gives it a good strength because the eggs are tiny, the size of your little fingernail, but when those eggs hatch and the young start to get bigger, the whole nest will expand and stretches so that the cobweb is incredibly strong and holds it all together. So, but they will nest again in woodland or woodland edge in a thicket of hawthorn or bramble, or even amongst hollies and so on, because it's so well disguised with the lichens that you'd hardly see it as there. If there's any questions, just shout away. There's another bird that it's more in coniferous woodland. In fact, if you go into a coniferous forest plantation, certainly commercial plantation, you're really only going to see maybe half a dozen species. The coal tit is one, and this is another one, the gold crest. And in old money, he's only 3.5 inches long, so from the tip of his tail to the tip of the bill. Gorgeous little bird, but again, you will get them, they'll forage certainly in broadleaf woodland, but they're more a bird of conifers. Build a tiny little nest on an overhanging bough, and the nest is kind of suspended like that, and again, it's held together with cobwebs. Very useful thing to have. Chaffinch, in Britain, the chaffinch is considered to, well, it's been, surveys have shown it's the most abundant species in the whole of Britain, but in Ireland not so, but they're still a very typical bird of broadleaf woodland, singing incessantly through the springtime. That's the male there. Very striking bird with big white patches, those wing bars on the wing. And they again will nest in a quite exposed place, but it's a very nicely camouflaged nest, usually putting lichens on the outside to conceal it. So that's the male, and the female is a slightly duller version, still has those wing bars, and she'll be the one that sits on the nest. In general, you'll notice that birds that nest certainly in any kind of exposed situation, the male is the flashy looking one, and the female has to forego all the fancy plumage so it can sit on the nest and not be seen. But the exceptions are, you notice how the blue tit, the great tit, the coal tit, and even the robin, male and female are identical. So they can afford to have a bit of colour in them because they're nesting in a cavity, so in a little concealed place so that they're not in the open. That's a nice bullfinch. Again, you think maybe, is it really a woodland species? Well, yes, you'll hear them. They're a funny little, the song, or at least the call, is a very uninspiring little, it sounds like a squeaky gate. Kind of a, can't even do it now. That's all you'll hear, and the song is only little notes, just variations on the theme. But they're a gorgeous bird, but they'll often be high in the canopy and eat into the buds of even oak trees in the springtime. And they've got a very distinct white rump. You can just about see it there at the base of the tail when the bullfinch flies away. I'm sure you all know your wood pigeons, very common species, but that clue is in the name. They're certainly found in woods. Of course, they're in farmland as well. very common, but one of those twi-stitcher doves, just to make sure. This is one that isn't so common, and in fact it's in a bit of trouble. It's the stock dove, and the stock dove is very similar to a wood pigeon, but you might notice on the wood pigeon he has this white on the side of the neck there, which stock dove doesn't have. They're a bigger bird and they're white on the wing. So the stock dove is smaller and is in a bit of trouble there. And for some of these ones that are in trouble, I'm putting the names up so you might remember them. The stock dove is so-called red listed. We have the BOCI, the Birds of Conservation Concern in Ireland, BOCI list. And we have the green are all the birds that are not considered in trouble. You've got amber listed birds and red listed birds. So red listed means birds of strong conservation concern, and amber is medium conservation concern. So stock dove, they nest again in holes in old mature trees, and you'll hear them singing in the woods. It's a very different song to the wood pigeon. It's a funny little sort of a ooh, 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 ooh. That's what you hear up in the treetops. And just to show you one of the differences is, this is a very unusual shot taken in Wexford, a friend of mine, but there's only, to see the odd one out in that, the very top, that's a wood pigeon at the top, and the other was a stock dove. Now normally if you see a flock of pigeons, you'll see a load of wood pigeons and maybe one stock dove if you're lucky. But the big difference is that they don't have, the stock dove is a very plain upper wing and doesn't have the little wing bars on the carpal joint or on the neck. So that's the first bird I'm showing you that's in a bit of trouble, and they really need farmland. See, in an ideal situation, many of these woodland birds, they need to be in a kind of a mosaic habitat where you've got maybe arable farmland beside, because they would feed in stubble, but they need big mature trees, and they will go into the forest to nest. You're probably familiar with the jay. It's a bird, you'll hear them probably more than you'll see them, a very raucous cry they have. Member of the crow family, very handsome if you see them up close. That lovely blue and black and white little stripy thing on the side of the wing is very striking. But the interesting thing about the jay is it's considered to have been very important in spreading oak woodland across Europe and probably in Ireland too. We'd say after one of the ice ages, what happens is the ice is retreating and oak trees start to move. What jays will do in the autumn is they'll gather acorns and go crazy. So you'll see 2 or 3 of them going at it and going at it. They'll find acorns on the ground or pick them off the tree, and they'll fly up and they'll bury them, make a little cache there, so I'll come back to that. And they've got them dotted all over the place. Now they've got good memories, they are crows, but they don't remember where they all are. And 1 or 2 of them get left behind. So I know if you think of the way some seeds disperse over distance, the wind carries them or whatever, with an acorn just drops straight to the ground. So it wouldn't be much use to have an acorn to try and germinate directly below, what's covered by a tree. So a jay is a very handy little farmer there who takes it off, even if it's only 20-30 meters, but probably it'll go further, it could go further. And a few of them will sprout, so they're instrumental in the spread of oak forests, the jay. Other birds, surprisingly, you wouldn't think it's a woodland bird, the cuckoo, you might associate it with, nowadays, in Wicklow you'll get them up around Loch Tay, Sally Gap, Coronation. Not very common, we don't get too many nowadays. They are in decline, they're mostly in the west of the country, out in Clare and Aran Islands, but I took that shot up in an oak forest right in the woodland. And it's interesting because normally, you know the way cuckoos lay the egg, single egg in each nest, usually it's meadow pipit, but they're known to use a number of host species, and including robins, so it's possible that, I don't know what it was going for in the middle of an oak wood. So, we just have to broaden our minds a bit. One that we maybe don't like to have in the garden that often, although it's all part of nature, of course, is the sparrowhawk, very much a woodland species. And they will nest usually in an old nest of a crow. They don't really build a nest. A lot of birds of prey are quite lazy that way. They just use another nest to lay the eggs in. Well, the sparrowhawk will go because they feed almost entirely on other smaller birds. And of course they have a great bonanza around about this time of year when there are lots of young birds around, they're a bit dopey and they can snatch them. So that's a sparrowhawk in flight, just to see. A kestrel will have pointed wings and they hover, whereas a sparrowhawk will soar in circles or go zipping over the hedgerows very quick, very low. Another bird of prey that I'm sure you're all becoming very familiar with is the buzzard, the common buzzard. And they used to be almost unknown in certain down in the Republic. They were there as a kid. Now the only place I ever saw them was going up to Northern Ireland. You get to cross the border at Lochloy and suddenly you start to see them over on the hills. And it's believed part of the reason they suddenly started to increase and spread seems to have been related to the banning of strychnine as a poison for farmers to poison foxes. But it seems to be more than that, because it's the same that was happening in the UK. In the UK it used to be just in Scotland, Wales and a few down around the New Forest. And now if you look at the atlas maps of the recent years, they're all over the place. So a highly successful species. They eat all sorts of prey items, including, when I'm talking to farmers and they're worried about buzzards, oh, you're taking the lambs, and no, they eat all the things you don't like wood pigeons and rabbits and rats and all that sort of thing. And they eat worms as well in the fields, believe it or not. Big birds, and they're all around us here down this part of the neck of the woods. I took that shot landed on a back garden. I'm doing the garden bird survey. I don't know if anybody do the garden bird survey, but I couldn't believe it. Buzzard. Now you get buzzards flying over, you can't count them in your survey, but this landed in the garden, just down the road here. But great bird. But that is a bird again that will nest in woodland. They'll often maybe pick a conifer, but again, if you had a single, for example, Scots pine in the middle of a broadleaf woodland, they would probably choose that spot for nesting. And you'll hear them when you go into forest. You'll hear them in woodland. So all of those we've been looking at are all resident species. Just a few migrant species. In other words, birds that come to us in the springtime. And one is the willow warbler. It's the commonest warbler we have in Ireland. They're mostly out in open country, but again in woodland edge or in clearings where there's a bit of lower vegetation, the so-called shrub layer. You get willow warblers. There are two species very similar, the willow warbler and the chipchap. Both look pretty distinct. But as often happens in nature, certainly with birds, if you get two species that look similar, songs are completely different. So the willow warbler has a lovely descending warbling song, and the one that looks very like it is the chipchap, and all they do is chip-chap, an onomatopoeic word, whereas the other one, I'm not really going to try and do a willow warbler, but it's kind of can't do it too dry. It's a descending song. Just go out and listen. There's still a few of them singing at the moment. So very common, and the chipchap also, but both, this is probably more of a woodland species really. You'll certainly get them high in the canopy, just cheep-chap, incessantly. It's one of the earliest migrants. They come into Ireland and usually around the middle of March, and they can be seen right into October. So these are all birds, and they would need a bit of the field layer, the ground layer in a woodland. If it's overgrazed by deer or whatever, they would need cover on the ground to nest. A bird that's now become very common and turning up all over the place is the blackcap. And I remember as a kid, I used to have to cycle down to Paris Court, down to the deer park in the summer to get blackcaps. It was a big ritual to go down. I'm talking now in the 70s, going off there. Then slowly they became more and more common, and now they're absolutely all over. So it's not all bad news, and we tend to give all the bad news, but there are some species doing quite well. And some populations are in a state of flux. Never quite clear why they're doing so well, but they are. That's as a breeding bird. This is a warbler, by the way, again. Okay? But some of you may have seen them in the winter as well. So there's a new thing that's happened where we have Eastern Europe birds coming to us in the winter and coming to our gardens. It was all researched and discovered only some years ago. So that's the blackcap. Put out half an apple for them in the winter. It's a good way to catch them, to encourage them in. And that is also a blackcap. These are white, it's got a red cap. That's a female blackcap. So there's a bit of a difference there, whereas the other warblers are very similar. Looked at. There are a few of the summer migrants, just a few others to come in a while. So I mentioned earlier, we don't really have any many, I should say, woodland specialists in this country. If you're over even across the water in Britain, they've got extra ones. They've got things like nuthatch. They've lots of willow tit and marsh tit, which we don't have. And tawny owls, they're all woodland species. I've got 3 species of woodpecker. So we don't have many species that you could really say are only found in woodland, but there are a few, and one really is this little fella here, the tree creeper, or somebody I saw in one of when I used to do the survey work, getting sheets sent in. Somebody put in tree crawler, but they had the right idea anyway, tree creeper. But they're always found. They're like little mouse that go up the tree. Always, there's one here now just carrying food. It's obviously gathering food to go to a nest. They use the tail pressed in against the trunk to give it balance, and they've a very fine, you might have noticed that, a very fine bill for poking in amongst the bark. So this is where you need standing deadwood or old, nice, gnarly trees with lots of nice, gnarly bark on it for them to feed on. Now they do nest in a cavity, in a hole, but not like your blue tits and great tits and so on. They tend to just nest under, if that was a bit of a bigger tree, just under a kind of a bit of bark that's kind of prized off the surface of the tree. And they'll always be going up a tree like that or out on a branch. You never see them on the ground or sitting out on a wire. It's always on a tree. And they'll go up, spiral up, and then fly all the way down to the next tree to work up that one as well. So it's a lovely little bird to get in woodland, and they have a very high-pitched shrill sound is usually how you detect them. They'll often mix in with tit flocks in the winter. Anybody see the bird? Yeah. So that's a woodcock sitting on a nest, and that's another red-listed species. So it's considered, not in great shape in terms of bird we have to look after it. Fantastically camouflaged, as you can see, in the nest on the ground and the leaf litter in the forest. You can get them certainly in coniferous woodland, but they like this kind of. You can see quite clearly these are oak leaves here, so this is in an oak wood here. But to that extent, when you're coming to manage or look after these forests, you need to have areas that are either fenced off or maybe signs up to keep people away, because ground nesting birds are vulnerable to disturbance. And so we're seeing 2 issues here. What we mentioned about deer overgrazing is a big issue with the field there and not getting a chance to flourish. But disturbance can be an issue with some species like woodcock. Your best chance of seeing a woodcock, a closer view of them there in case you can't see, you can see the eye. Your best chance of ever seeing one is to go out, probably not too late, a bit late now, really from February, March, April, May, go out to any forest ride, anywhere. And we used to do it up Glen Of The Downs, I used to do it a lot, and just wait at dusk and you can see them doing their display. It's called roading. It's not like you might know about snipe doing drumming when they do a big thing in the air. These are similar to snipe, but they do this thing where they do a very slow, funny kind of a fluttery flight, just and making a funny little sound, which you'll usually hear first, kind of a. And they also have another strange grunting sound. And the first time I heard that, I was camping up near Joust in Paddock Lake there with some other lads, and we were out just walking the night hoping for something, listening to hope get night jars, and we heard this thing. We were scurrying back to the tent thinking the place was haunted. But they're fascinating birds. There have been surveys done on woodcock, and the only way to survey them is to get out in the springtime and see to monitor or count the number of sightings you get of them. As soon as you get 2 interacting in the air, 2 males having a go at each other. Very long bill, they've a very sensitive tip to the bill. They probe for worms and that. In fact, I remember one night watching them at the Glen Of The Downs flying around, and towards evening I was walking down and looking onto one of the greens of the Bellevue Golf Club, and there was a woodcock walking around on the golf. I could hardly see it; it was almost pitch black. But so they fly out onto those kind of short grass areas sometimes to feed. So that's a woodcock. Now, sorry, it's on a washing line, but it just happens to be. I got a very bird to photograph. This happened to one down in Cape Clear, would you believe? We were walking back from on a course I had given down there, and we just said, "What's that down there?" And I was on somebody's washing line, just it was middle of the afternoon, and fired off a few shots, and it was just nice to see. But they're gorgeous birds. They are definitely in the Glen Of The Downs, and they are pretty secretive and quiet. They don't have the twit-to-woo sound that you'll hear Tony owls. I mean, if you're ever watching a film set in Ireland and you hear, twit-to-woo, that's a Tony owl. You don't get them in Ireland. Somebody's just gone to the sound library and said, that's a nice night sound. These guys have a very quiet sound. It's kind of a very little, really quiet. You'd have to be, maybe, you'd have to be certainly within 50 meters, probably 30, 20 meters to hear it sometimes. Long-eared owl. The ears, of course, are not real ears. They're just tufts. They're just for display. Birds' ears are behind the eye, and in the case of owls, they're kind of on either side of that facial disc. And in fact, you probably know this about owls, they have the ears are slightly set asymmetrically, so when they're hunting, they not only have amazing eyesight and practically see in the dark, but their ears are picking up little rustles down below. And because the ears are set off balance, they can pinpoint very accurately where the sound is coming from down below them. But they're lovely birds, and if you're lucky, if you happen to get to a place, you might get one roosting, usually in by the trunk of a tree. But I know they are in the Glen. I haven't seen them there for a long time, but I know they are there. And that's what the young ones look like. Certainly in BirdWatch over the years, we got so many calls from people calling that say we always knew the same thing was going to happen around about the 10th of June onwards. You get somebody coming on and say, "Well, I've heard this strange sound," and you say, "Sorry, can I interrupt you? Was it a kind of a?" And you start to say the sound. I had one woman come on one time, and she said she was an opera singer, and she said, "I'll do it for you," she said, and she went, and she went, eek, eek. So that's the sound they make, but you hear them making these contact notes when they leave the nest, and they hop around, and they're being fed for weeks after leaving the nest. So again, you need mature trees. So it's a long way down the road before the new patch of land gets nice mature trees in it, but they need mature ones. That's just a shot up along the trails up there. Springs and Sentinel there. These are actually beach here, but look at the holly there. That's the ideal woodland would have a nice shrub layer and a nice field layer, as we call it. In other words, things like brockens and all down at the lower level, and then maybe some little birch and in this case holly. Holly will survive very well in the shade underneath, and of course they are native, which is really important. And what we're mostly talking about with all of this are oak woodlands, the familiar oak tree, oak leaf, oak shape, and not so much these guys. I mean, you will get birds in I think in an ideal world you'd have the occasional conifer, just to facilitate the coal tits and the goldcrest and so on. But conifers, generally speaking, are very gloomy places, and certainly the dense plantations we have in this country. So I'm going to look at another couple of interesting species. One that we'd be particularly interested in locally here is this bird here. It's the spotted flycatcher, and this is an amber listed bird, which means it's of moderate concern, medium conservation concern. Spotted flycatcher, it's called spotted because there are some little tiny spots up there in the upper breast and the crown as well. And they're a bird that you'll see them in farmland as well, but they are really a woodland species. They will nest right in, again, if you have a tree with some little bits of kind of small scraggly branches sticking out here, and they'll just nest in there just by the trunk. And they will take to nest boxes if you put them up and open front of nest boxes. So that's a bird, that's a migrant now. It comes up here from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and they are not in good shape. Well, they're around, but they're declining, unfortunately. Now, one that's really special in Wicklow is this one here, the pied flycatcher. I haven't seen one in Wicklow in a good few years, but did have a breeding pair in Bellevue a few years ago, and we had two males up near Lara a couple of years before that. A friend of mine used to put up nest boxes and get them using them in various spots in Wicklow. Almost exclusively in oak woodland, the pied flycatcher. And it's very strange because across in Wales, just across the Irish Sea, in some of the Welsh valleys, you can get dozens and dozens of these in just one nature reserve or one bit of forest. So it's just that barrier of the Irish Sea means some of these birds barely make it across to us. But Wicklow, of course, is one of the best places around for the lovely oak woodlands we have. So that's the male pied flycatcher. It's amber listed not because it's endangered necessarily, because it is so rare here as much as anything as a breeder. And that, believe it or not, is the female. So females get a bit of a raw deal of the plumage straights, as you can see. And they do nest in a hole, which is unusual. It goes against all I said earlier, but anyway. That's a female, and you can still see the patch on the wing. So if you were looking at flycatchers, a spotted flycatcher has the little spots and much longer. It's a bigger bird and it doesn't have those flashes on the wing. And there's a photo of a pied flycatcher in a nest box over there, you can see. And they found that in Wales they managed to massively increase the population. At least they put it down to the provision of nest boxes, because even with nicely managed trees that you don't cut away all the dead bits and leave little nest cavities, if you put up boxes, it just makes it all the easier for them. And they, over a period of a couple of decades, they something like trebled the population over in Wales, and certainly in some of the nature reserves. So it's worth thinking about as well as a woodland develops, or even within the existing woodland. Of course, the problem with nest boxes is vandalism, or how high do you put them, and also maintenance, because they do need to should be cleaned out ideally each year. But it's something to always consider, just to help them up. One way to help them on their way, because they need the habitat, they need the food, but they also need the actual place to live, and in that case it's a cavity. I mean, many of the holes in trees aren't great because they fill up with water. Another very special one that we find in Wicklow is the red star. This is a red listed species. So I remember finding nests up in Glendalough, just above the hairpin, as we call it, just not too far from the car park, and we used to get them in Glen, had them up in Cronyburn. Beautiful bird, but in recent years hardly turning up at all. It's another migrant coming up from sub-Saharan Africa. They have to take their chances going across the Med with all the hunting and all the other problems they have. So there are huge pressures on migrant birds of huge mortality. But it would be lovely to make the habitat right for them for to maybe make a comeback. Hard to know what's going to happen. But that's a male, gorgeous bird. You see the tail on it, lovely red colour, and they're about the size of a robin. They look a bit like a robin at first glance. When they land, the tail has a little wobble in it, almost like it's not very well attached to the body. And it's a distinctive thing, and that red star is where they get the name. So the female here again gets a bit of a raw deal. Has a reddish tail, wobbly tail. It's the common red star. Then we have another one here which is kind of special and he's gone very scarce now, is the wood warbler. I don't know whether you remember the willow warbler earlier, but it kind of looks at first glance like a willow warbler, but can you see how long the wings are? That's one of the distinctive features, the huge, what we call primary projection. The length of the wing is incredible. They've also got a lovely white underside contrasting with this sort of lemon yellow around the head area, and a gorgeous little song which has been likened to the sound of if you had a coin and you let it go, that's the kind of sound. I'm not even going to attempt to do the actual sound, but they have a second part to their song, which is definitely can't do that. And it's kind of like it's a very plaintive little sound. You'll often get a male singing away like that, and it's kind of pathetic when they're singing for a week or two in the same place and never finds a female. So the last breeding pair I saw was up near Glendalough a couple of years ago, near St. Saviour's little graveyard place. But when you get them singing away like that, it's wonderful, gorgeous sound, and it's a real oak woodland speciality. It's a wood warbler, so not common, and very much. Nearly all the breeding records for Ireland have been in County Wicklow, and it's no accident because of the oak woodland. And again, to emphasise, wood water needs this kind of habitat, needs your wood rush and all this down at the field layer, the ground layer of plants, so they nest right down at ground level and they get a nest. The purposely wasn't going to put too many graphs or any statistics or anything, but just for interest's sake, my work was for 25 years with BirdWatch has been with the Countryside Bird Survey, and we could produce graphs every so often of trends. It was all about trends. We're counting the same sites year after year after year after year, and then you put it all into the computer and let it produce a trend. So this is just showing some trends here, and those codes there at the top. SF is spotted flycatcher, so you can see this dark blue one, boom, 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 up and down. Now it's actually gone down since that. That was only showing the first 10 years of the CBS. So as often happens with migrant species, you get this fluctuation from year, because they have good years and bad years. Maybe they have a bad, a storm over the Sahara or some other place. On migration, you get great mortality, so they do fluctuate. But look at this, the one I'm going to single out here, the red one is blackcap. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, the blackcaps are really skyrocketed, and there's no simple explanation as to why they're doing so well. Could be, dare we say it, a benefit of climate change, that in fact they are enjoying the slightly milder weather in the spring. So there's always another side to these things. So it's kind of getting towards the end, because we've covered most of the woodland species really. But coming to a particular favourite of mine, I spent a long time watching these birds. I was up in Cronyburn, 2007, 2nd of June, having my lunch, and I heard this call up above me. It said, "Grey-spotted woodpecker, I can't believe it." Now, up to that point, I'd only ever seen two, I think, in Ireland. The first one was in 1989. I went out to Galway to see a grey-spotted woodpecker, because they were not a bird that we had in Ireland, just the odd one turned up. So I could not believe it. And then the following year, 2008, one of the rangers told me that he heard one drumming. I said, "Drumming in Ireland? Drumming is the really loud tapping sound. They're not feeding and they're not digging a hole. When they're making that noise, that's their version of singing. They're holding territory." So when I heard that, I went up and I had the bird, and then while I was watching it a few days later, I saw a second bird fly. I thought, "Oh my God, two woodpeckers," and it turned out to be a female. We didn't find any nests that year. I cut the whole thing short and say that in 2009, a team of us got together and we started finding nests and improving breeding. So it was all happening in quite a rush, that suddenly this major change was happening, that woodpeckers were in Ireland. And that's what one looks like. That's a nice male there. You can just see the bit of red in the back of the head. If you look at any of the bird books, certainly any that were published pre, the last 15 years, this is the distribution map you'll see. In fact, grey-spotted woodpeckers found on the Canaries, and they're found right over in Japan. So that's a little bit hard done by. Certainly, as a young budding birder, I felt really hard done by that we didn't have any woodpeckers in Ireland. They've got in Britain they've got three species. They've got the lesser spotted, the green, and the grey spotted. You go to France and you get 5 species. You go to Hungary and Slovakia and places like that, Poland, you're getting 10 species. So it's that's a real diversity gradient, as we call it, from a really rich, Central European area with very mature forests. As you go out towards our little island out in the Atlantic, we had no woodpeckers. But you notice Iceland didn't have them either. They haven't too many trees, but nor did the Isle of Man. And interestingly, the Isle of Man started to be colonised in the same year, or 2 years after our one started to turn up, which is fascinating. But what used to be the case is that, and still probably is, every so often you get Scandinavian grey-spotted woodpeckers coming down our way. You get what's called an eruption, and this is like throughout the range. Grey-spotted woodpeckers are sedentary; they don't go moving anywhere really. But the northern ones are mostly feeding on pine cone seeds in the winter, and every 5 or 10 years you might get a really bad crop of pine cone seeds, so they migrate, they move off looking for food. So the one I went for in Galway in 1989 was obviously a bird in one of these eruptions. It found its way out to Galway. But now the birds we have established, and they need this kind of thing. They need this is in winter, but even still, there's a lot of standing deadwood here, and this is the kind of, this is all oaks here, and it's the kind of place that they love. We found nests in there. And this was the very first nest a friend of mine found. I was raging. We were working together trying to improve the first breeding, and he pipped me to it. I was on a boat, would you believe, up off Rathlin Island, sailing, and I got a call. I don't believe it, it was the 2nd of May or something. That hole we were looking at a few weeks ago, it's occupied. And I went, as soon as I got home, I went, and there it was, looking at it, Rebecca looking at it, which is, and the rest was history. Like, I spent the next 7 years then studying them and put together a bit of a paper on it with Faith Wilson, and we found lots of interesting information long before they've become as common as they are now. They're all over the place. That's a typical, sometimes the nest hole will be made where there's been a branch and broken off, and some little element of rot has got into the trunk, and it makes it easier for them to get in, to excavate a cavity. And this was a situation when we started to find nests that were birds incubating. Here you have a changeover where the females, that's the male. Females has been incubating maybe for an hour or two, and then suddenly the male comes, gives a little call, out she comes, and he goes in. All very slick and very quick, and usually quite high. Most of the nests were, 10, 15 meters up the trees. And there's a proper view of a male. It's actually on a beech tree, but they're nearly always on oaks. We've had them in all kinds of trees, but that's the male with the red spot on the back of the head. Has anybody had woodpeckers in the garden or anywhere? Yeah? Two? Two, right, yeah. We only recently got them, yeah, right. We only recently started getting two now this spring. That's the male, and there's the female. You can see it's pretty well identical. Time and again you'd say, does it have any red on the head? Oh yeah, red on this. I didn't really know where the red was. They both got the red underneath, but the female doesn't have red on the back of the head. And when you're watching them, I spent many hours watching them coming in and out of the nest holes. This is one taking away the fecal sac. Most birds, certainly most birds you get in forests and woodland and so on, they'll take away the excreta from the young, then there's the fecal little sac. So it's got a lot of bits of bark and things in it as well, but sometimes you'd see more clearly. It's a white little globe. And I found the males, would you believe, are much more house proud than the females. They'll sit there for hours in the height, and you put a clicker for this, clicker for the female, male, female, and probably about 2/3 of the time it'll be males doing the cleaning up. There you go. But she's done the hard work to produce the eggs. So usually have 5 to 7 eggs, and then there comes a point when the young start to poke the head out. You only ever see one young one at a time because the hole is quite small. But they've got red on the top of the head. So if anybody's had in your garden one with the red on the top of the head right now, it's a juvenile. In other words, only out of the nest a few weeks. They would have flown in early June. But one thing I discovered to get some idea of how many young were in nests was to keep watching and photograph and analyse the amount of red on the head. And it was in the same nest. I had that one, and then I had that one. So the red goes further back. And in fact, the most I ever got in any nest was 3, but we know that there are more because we've occasionally watched them leaving the nest. Anybody find the nest hole in that? Because it's quite hard work to find. I'll give you a hint, it's just above the centre. I'll give you another hint, there it is. So that's the kind of thing you're looking for, the nest holes. So again, it's mature trees, but they are in the glen. I certainly saw one a few weeks ago flying across the road from the Glenview direction over to the northeast side, I suppose, of the Glen Of The Downs. So I haven't ever managed to find a nest. I find the glen quite difficult to hear because of the traffic below. I think up where all the new area might be a little bit quieter, I think, hopefully. But so that's kind of it. Oh, just to say, yeah, we had all this great mystery as to where did they come from and what was going on. Why were these birds suddenly starting to a species that is highly sedentary and just does not move, usually more than a few kilometres in its whole lifetime. Suddenly they were turning up. This is the British Trust for Ornithology produced this graph the common bird census lumped with the breeding bird census. I won't go into the details, but just to show the general gist of that is that in that period there, the population in Britain was skyrocketing. And the reasons for it are believed to be partly the advent of Dutch elm disease in Britain was a big thing in the 60s, 70s, and a lot of dead trees, so a lot more nest sites, but nest availability, but also feeding. The starlings, which I believe actually compete with woodpeckers at the nest hole. A woodpecker can create a nest hole, and then the starlings can oust them, believe it or not. You'd imagine a woodpecker that can dig out a hole that deep would be able to defend itself. So starlings are declining in Britain, and have been for quite some time. So with them going down, it gave the woodpeckers a chance to be on the up. And there's other various ideas that have been put forward, but it seems that the population in Britain was getting to almost capacity, and a few pioneers just came across, because they were hitting County Down at the same time as Wicklow. In fact, they were a year ahead of us. That was the first definite breeding on the island. But all of this period all coincided with the most recent breeding bird atlas, which produces nice maps. And this is showing, just show you how common or how widespread grey-spotted woodpeckers are in Britain. These dots all represent a 10 kilometre square, and you can see within that period, 2007 to 2011, you can see they're up in County Down, Isle of Man and Wicklow. And now we'd love you to know that they'd be in an awful lot more that are right across into Kerry, and some of them go. They'll probably never get to parts of Mayo where there's lots of bog. But this is the so-called change map, which is, and you can do this with all the different species. You can produce a change map. So all those black dots are 10 kilometre squares that now have definite breeding of grey-spotted woodpeckers that didn't have in the previous atlases over the 40 years. So you can see, even in Britain, there were lots of things happening. So they were migrating north, or not migrating so much as having a range expansion into Scotland, across the Irish Sea to Isle of Man, Northern Ireland, and to Wicklow, which was very interesting. I remember giving talks on woodpeckers, and somebody in the audience would pipe up, "Oh, I heard they were introduced," or "Who brought them in," or "How did they get here?" And you just try to explain. You've explained all of this, and then they ask you, "How did they get here?" And, well, it's just one of those things, and nature reports are backing, so obviously they got to a point that they migrated across the Irish Sea. Just to finish up then, just a few things out of from the woodpecker thing, because it's kind of indicative of a lot of woodland species, the ups and downs, but it's a kind of a success story, I suppose. Just for interest's sake, in that period that we were doing the study, the 7 years, look at Wicklow trumps all the way as being the place with the most nests. Now, admittedly, the amount of effort is also a factor in all this. We didn't have people too many people down in Carlow or in Louth or whatever looking for nests. And also, maybe also very significant in that period, each year the number of nests, oak is at the very top again, really important tree. I mean, an oak tree, the All Ireland pollinator, what do they call themselves? All Ireland pollinator plan. Yeah, they've come up with a figure of 284 species of insects or invertebrates hang out in an oak tree, or can hang out in an oak tree. So an oak tree supports a huge amount of insect life, and that supports all these birds that we're talking about. They're nearly all insectivores, all the warblers. The woodpeckers eat mostly insects. They will go for nuts and things as well. So it's very important to make the habitat right, in this case, the trees right. It'll all do its own thing. But we even had one in the eucalyptus tree, you can see there, and that was up in Avondale. That pair, the first year they were in a beech, the next year they were in a larch, the next year in a eucalyptus, the next year in a spruce of some sort. That's the same pair, I don't know, but they're in the same little area, so I reckon if you're living in an arboretum, you might as well try them all, try all the various trees. But anyway, this oak is really at the top of the thing. And so one of the things out of all of that is that a lot of people are seeing woodpeckers for the first time. The way to see them is coming to your garden. That's a lovely juvenile there. That red will be, they'll lose that towards the autumn, around about October, they'll molt. And one thing I only discovered myself, I never saw it in any literature, but You see the so-called undertail coverts, those feathers at the base of the tail on the underside. On the juveniles it's kind of pink, it's like a salmon pink, whereas on the adults it was a blood red colour. And it's often an indication, even when they lose the red on the top of the head, it's what we call a first year bird. So if you're looking in next May or June and you see a woodpecker, they'll often retain a sort of paleness to those undertail feathers. Anyway, that's a bit of trivia for you to look out for. And to finish then, one little aspect of all of this interesting thing about woodpeckers is that they introduce a new element to a lot of trees. They produce holes for those cavity nesters, you know, your blue tit, your red start, or great tit is a blue tit as a nest hole. That was on Ruddery a few years ago. This was one I had more recently, a spotted flycatcher actually using an old woodpecker hole. Now that's in an old spruce, but they open up a bit and obviously start to degrade. Sometimes the woodpeckers will use the nest again and again, but once the hole expands like that, and then other birds can move in. And this is a spotted flycatcher nesting there. And that's just a blue tit in the nest hole. That was to remind me to tell you how a lot of these, like woodpeckers again, both sexes very brightly coloured, whereas the birds that nest in hedgerows not so. So I'll leave you with that. That's a little juvenile on the ground, literally just out of the nest, and leave you with that thought. Okay, thank you very much.